Welcome to another Pearson Centre webinar on the theme of COVID and beyond. My name is Francesca Iacorto and I'm an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre. I'm also the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Airlines Council of Canada. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre is a progressive think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. Our ongoing project is called COVID and Beyond, recognizing that we have a lot of issues to address in this era of COVID-19 and that the recovery and rebuilding will be slow and long and an important time to reimagine Canada. Before we go on though, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors who make these events possible. The event sponsor today is Aurora Strategy Group, while our two sustaining sponsors are first, Canada's Building Trades Unions, and second, the International Association of Firefighters. While these webinars are free to attend, please feel free to visit our website at the Pearson Centre, all in one word, .ca and make a contribution. Now back to the panel. Today we will talk about the climate crisis and COVID-19 with a special focus on the ideas from young people. We have an amazing panel today. We have with us Meredith Adler, who's the Executive Director at Student Energy. We have Stella Markovska, who is an organizer and communications specialist at Sustainabiliteens. We have Michaela Tam, who is a development research analyst at NetHope and the former co-president at University of Toronto Environmental Action. And last, but by certainly no means least, we have with us Amos, who's the Member of Parliament for Pontiac and the Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board with a focus on science. He's also a former director of the U Ottawa Eco-Justice Environmental Clinic. And I'm also pleased to tell you that our moderator today is Ashwin Nair, who's a social policy researcher at the Pearson Centre. With respect to the format, the discussion will last about 40 minutes and then be followed by a Q&A period that will be moderated by the Pearson Centre President, Andrew Cardozo, before we wrap up at 3 o'clock or shortly thereafter. Please use the question box on your screen and we will get to as many questions as we can. On a final note, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the Pearson YouTube channel later on this afternoon. Just go to YouTube and search for Pearson Centre and you'll be there. It will also be available via podcast in a few days. On that note, over to you, Ashwin Nair.
Thank you, Francesca, and thanks to all the panelists for agreeing to be here for this very important and very timely discussion on the climate crisis and COVID-19. Let's jump straight into it. So the COVID-19 and climate crises are both crises, one with very tangible outcomes, while the other is still treated with somewhat a lack of urgency by larger society. How similar or different in your estimation, and we'll start with Michaela Tam, how similar or different in your estimation do the COVID-19 and climate crises look? And what are the parallels between the two crises in terms of their effects on communities at large, but also on people that are traditionally marginalized? Michaela Tam?
Good question. I think that the communities that have disproportionately felt the virus, poor communities, Indigenous communities, Black and other racialized communities in both the global North and particularly throughout a lot of the global South, are the very same ones who have and already are and will unequally experience the impacts of climate change. And this unfortunately comes as no surprise, as communities that face barriers to access to public needs such as healthcare, food, shelter, water, etc., and communities with demographics that have precarious employment and essential jobs are hardest hit by the pandemic. I'm coming here from Toronto, so I'm citing Toronto Public Health, for example. They recently presented data that demonstrated that lower income and racialized communities suffer from greater impact from COVID. But in general, in Canada, race-based data hasn't been universally collected or publicized, which is a real problem because it prevents us from tackling the root causes of what's driving the pandemic. And I think we often compare ourselves as better to our southern neighbors. Ontario Premier Doug Ford recently said that Canada doesn't have systemic deep roots of racism like the US does, but it's this very comparison and the lack of race-based data that contributes to masking these problems in Canada. So the question is, how can you find long-term solutions to the pandemic or climate change if you don't address nor acknowledge systemic inequalities? It's the same logic of exploitation and exclusion that allows for underfunded healthcare to certain communities, that continues to subsidize the fossil fuel sector and prevents us from centering the voices that are most affected. And environmentally destructive and emissions increasing activities continue to have they continue to happen in certain communities that are seen as more disposable than others, such as hazardous facilities or polluting industries that tend to be located very closely to Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color in Canada. And on an international level, Canada has recently been in dispute with the Philippines because we've continually shipped our waste there, illegally too. So what I'm trying to say here is, I think the parallels between climate change and COVID lie in the fact that intersecting social inequalities, for example, race, class, gender, able-bodiedness, age, have contributed to our lack of resilience to the problem and are obstacles to our effective response in crises, any crises for that matter. Though they're felt by everyone, they're not felt evenly. And I really want to hit this point home. And these crises actually make visible and amplify all the existing structural inequalities in our current socioeconomic orders, and they're on multiple levels. So the solution to these crises are also parallel to one another, because we need to address the roots of the problem in the socioeconomic systems that we're in, and that requires a lot more transformative change than we're seeing now. And those who feel the effects disproportionately now and in the future, like youth, since this is part of the conversation today, need to be a part of the process in fixing the problem. And in all honesty, need to be a bigger part of the conversation.
What about you, Stella Markovska? How similar or different do the COVID-19 and climate crises look like in terms of their effects on communities and human beings?
Yeah, so I think they look very similar. They're both very intersectional issues. And as Micaela said, they're both affecting marginalized communities much more than they're affecting other communities, although they will be affecting everyone, especially the climate crisis will be affecting youth and our futures. And I think we need to stop treating these things as though they were separate things, like the COVID-19 crisis, the climate crisis, systematic racism and whatnot. So because they're really all connected, and we can't have climate justice if we don't have equity, and we need to be finding the roots of where these issues come from, and we need to be treating them as if they're all crises because they are, because we need to really start taking action and sort of addressing the roots of these issues, not as though they were separate issues, and not arguing over which one should come first, because they're all really connected. We need to be addressing all these issues as though they were one big issue in our systems, and finding the root causes and addressing that.
Okay, so having experienced the twofold nature of this pandemic, you have the public health crisis on the one hand, followed by the economic crisis. Are we, and the question is, are we experiencing sort of a cultural shift in terms of the way that we view the climate crisis? And is there a generational divide to this cultural shift? And Stella Markovska, I think I'll start with you again.
Yeah, so I think we are. I think especially the climate crisis has been a very sort of abstract issue, but now that we're seeing how with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're kind of seeing how quickly things can change in ways that we've never imagined, and the urgency of a situation can grow seemingly overnight. And the same thing will be happening with the climate crisis. We're also seeing the effects of the climate crisis more and more. We're seeing increases in natural disasters all over the globe. We're seeing people being affected, especially marginalized communities, more and more. So I think there will be, and I hope there will be, because I think this sort of, issues are becoming more and more tangible. We're seeing the more and more of the outcomes of the climate crisis. So hopefully this will be sort of urge us to take action. And I think, for the generational divide, whereas younger generations will be more affected by the climate crisis because our futures are really at stake, older generations are going to be more affected by the COVID-19 crisis. And I think instead of sort of separating these issues, we need to have compassion for each other, and we need to be working together so that younger generations should be doing everything in their power to prevent the spread of the pandemic. But older generations should be taking action towards the climate crisis, should be investing in clean energy, moving away from the fossil fuel industry to protect our futures as well, because these issues are really connected. So if we work together and if we sort of take action on both issues, it'll be like a win-win instead of sort of separating which one is more urgent, because they're both very urgent issues. They're both emergencies.
Well, Amos, are we experiencing a cultural shift in the way that we perceive the climate crisis and its urgency particularly? Oh, sorry, Will, you're on mute.
That's a really great question, Ashwin. Thank you very much also to everyone for having me. I think that it's almost too early to say whether we're experiencing a cultural shift, but I think it's impossible to contemplate a world where the COVID-19 pandemic and all that it involves, the health crisis, the economic crisis, the transformation in our interactions as humans, I find it's impossible to conceive of that not impacting our approach to the climate crisis. And I think it also fundamentally impacts society's views on things as broad as science, as government. And so I think that, I mean, it's necessarily going to impact it. How? I think it's too early to tell. I really appreciated what Stella had to say about that, the increasing importance of a sort of intergenerational empathy, and the requirement that both younger Canadians appreciate the dangerous, the more vulnerable circumstances that our seniors find themselves in, and vice versa on the climate issue. So this is, we're dealing with two different problems, but both are immediate. And I think that it's important for, I'm sure I'm an old guy. I'm a dad with two kids who are one's entering high school, one's in grade school. But it wasn't that long ago that I was a young Canadian. I was in high school when we went through that second wave of the environmental movement back in the early 1990s. And, I appreciate that, after many years in the trenches as an environmental lawyer, and now having sort of transformed into an elected politician, the burden is heavy on government and on elected Canadians. We have to do better by the generations to come. Will COVID help us seize this moment? I think so. I truly think so. I think that we're going to see this even as as short term as the speech from the throne that will be coming up on September 23rd. I fully expect to see very strong signals from our government and an invitation to Parliament to support an agenda that is very strong on a green recovery, because I mean we have no other options. We can't lose sight of the tragedy of the horizon because we're so focused on the tragedy of the present and the pandemic of the present. We have to have that long and short term kind of view. I'll leave it at that for now.
And we'll get to the speech from the throne later on in the webinar. Meredith, Adler, Stella and Will talked about generating this intergenerational energy when it comes to the climate crisis. What's our path forward on that?
That's a great question. I think Micaela and Stella both made really good points on where the fundamental difference is often between young people and even actually those who are older members of the environmental movement now, or people who are traditionally part of environmental think tanks, and that young people are really focused on how do we take this need for an energy transition and this need to shift to adapt to climate change and actually fundamentally shift the power dynamics that the world operates in. Young people are much more focused on equity, and I think Student Energy, we have a network of 50,000 students in 120 different countries, and so we're very much working with a lot of the young people who are very impacted by this. And what we're hearing across the board in every country and all across Canada is that, you know, if we solved for climate crisis, if we only solved for carbon emissions and we increased inequality and we increased kind of human rights issues and Indigenous people still don't have clean drinking water and all of these things, then we really won't have we won't have solved the problem or created the world that we should create when we're looking at making this large scale of a shift. And so I think the good news on that is that, especially when it comes to energy, which is a lot of what student energy focuses on, in the energy industry is incredibly complex and everybody's very dependent on it. You're dependent on it for your education, for your healthcare, for heating and cooling, which are becoming increasingly important issues in Canada. And so with that complexity, what it really opens up the opportunity to do is foster very sincere intergenerational collaboration, because it's been proven that youth innovation and young people, when assisted with the right skill set and coaches and mentors, young people are really able to rise to the occasion and provide new ideas, and are actually neurologically wired to kind of think outside the box. And there's a beauty to not knowing what they don't know yet about the risk management strategies of the energy industry and other things that are often seen as limiting for both politicians, regulators, and the industry itself. And so when you take young people who are skilled and ambitious and care about these issues and pair them with folks who have been in the industry for 30 years or politicians or others, you really can make magic happen in terms of accelerating some of these ambitious ideas that we need, and really beyond just technology development, accelerating implementation and thinking about it differently in terms of, it's not just this elite pocket of people who understand climate that we need to shift, and it's not just politicians, and it's not just about getting the CEOs on board. It's actually about, how do our neighborhoods relate to this? How do our parents relate to this, and our siblings? And I think that's what young people really bring to the table, is amazing implementation strategies and new ways to look at the issues. And what other generations bring to the table is really some concrete offerings around these highly technical pieces that we need to understand, so that we don't end up in situations where the power grid doesn't work, or where these essential services that we get from the things that are currently causing climate change go away, because that's also would create a new human crisis, if you will.
Okay. What do you think, and Meredith, I'll start with you again, what do you think we have learned tangibly from the COVID-19 crisis that is instrumental in understanding and addressing the climate crisis? And Stella alluded to this, they're not entirely necessarily separate, but what have we learned tangibly from the COVID-19 crisis?
The fundamental thing that springs to mind is we've learned how important a human connection to an issue is. COVID is something that's very immediate. It's in people's faces because it has to do with their health and the health of their loved ones. And I think that is actually something that, if I can be a little critical of the environmental movement, that is a connection that has often been lost in talking about the shiny pennies of solar panels and EVs and chargers and all of these things. It's like, yeah, but how does that relate to me? How does that give my kids? You know, how does that keep my grandmother safe? And so I actually think that, you know, there's a lot to be learned about what will people sacrifice in terms of, we've had a huge economic hit, and primarily Canadians have felt that that's okay because it is saving lives, right? And so, and I'm not suggesting that we shut down the whole world in the name of climate change tomorrow, but how do we start to internalize what it is that climate action means, and how we are protecting the health and well-being of those that we care about, and then also how can we leverage this moment of disruption to create a more positive future. So I think there's a huge communications lesson actually within this. And then I think that the other thing that we've seen is it's really heartening how people can step up to the plate, and how much people are willing to kind of chip in together. And I think that does actually provide a new way forward in terms of what mechanisms should we be looking at. And I think what's really telling, and what actually speaks to youth power within climate, is how much solutions have come from unlikely suspects. And I think this is something for the government to really take away, is often there are really set, you know, high-level advisors that people are listening to, or you know, committees that do this or that or the other thing. Those are actually very generally exclusive and elitist institutions. And I think it really excludes a lot of people who could have ideas or who could contribute to the conversation from creating those solutions. And so I think it's a really big wake-up call for everyone to think beyond, I know this is a think tank, but to think beyond the think tank and to think about how do we actually harvest ideas and momentum from our communities, and what would a more grassroots, ground-up solution look like?
Michaela Tam, same question to you. What do you think we have learned tangibly from the COVID-19 crisis that is instrumental to understanding and addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Meredith has been saying, especially with finding grassroots solutions and really listening to those voices that we might not have listened to previously. I think we can also address this question in two ways. Firstly, how have we as citizens changed in the way that we understand and address the climate crisis in just the past 5 to 6 months? As has been mentioned already, we've seen massive job loss. We've seen almost 180 shift in how we socially interact with one another. And we've seen a movement against police brutality and racial injustice. And I think that's really important, because it's not happenstance that we saw worldwide protests against anti-Black racism and police brutality at the scale that we did in the midst of a global pandemic. And as what Stella was saying, a lot of the intersections of the problem are becoming a lot more tangible and harder to ignore. So I think there's been a shift from discourses that have internalized and normalized this idea that our problems are our own, that our success or failure is a factor of our personal responsibility. In the social media and news conversations with people my age, at least, I've noticed a shift in understanding the structural and systemic inequalities that contribute to this crisis. I will note that I have been seeing some toxic moral posturing going on in the left social media as well that we can't ignore. People trying to, using youth terms, out woke one another. But I think countering that, we've also mentioned that there's greater calls for empathetic understanding, intergenerational kind of conversations, introspection, and acknowledgement of the privilege that we have as well. And we've also had to deal with going digital. The article that my friend Zaharine and I are working on, I'm helping her edit it, explores sort of the future direction of climate justice movement and how that might be under COVID-19, and how we can instead use tools like social media to center marginalized voices. And I think in this context, a lot of people have been talking about how to maintain solidarity through digital organization. And in our digital age, I think we can potentially reach across geographical barriers and connect with people we wouldn't have otherwise. We're finding a lot more innovative new techniques about how to build solidarity in ways that we haven't done before. So yes, concerns about corporate surveillance and accessibility have always existed and I think with new ways to communicate, we'll see new forms of the same issues, but it also brings really great and innovative opportunities to come together and call for greater accountability. I think we can also answer this question by looking at learning points for the Canadian government with regards to addressing this issue. Number one, we have the data, we have the scientific evidence, we need to act as soon as possible. And the fact that we knew that this virus was spreading across countries and continents months before our first known case in Canada, had health officials still say that it was a little risk, even though we knew that we already had our first and second presumptive patients. It's kind of crazy. There's a lack of foresight in securing personal protective equipment and testing kits, not much preparation with long-term care homes or Indigenous communities, though this has been somewhat addressed now. And these are learning points. Though we're comparatively doing better than the United States, compared to the rest of the world, we're actually not that impressive. And I think that that's something that we should also take note of. And it would be unthinkable now if we at this point still didn't have specific action plans with clear targets and timelines for eliminating COVID in Canada, which we do. And so it's really unthinkable that the government still doesn't have a detailed, overarching, specific, nor enforceable law with regards to sustainable development that all governments can adhere to. given that climate change actually inflicts damage over a much longer period. So yeah, I think that it's sort of a twofold thing.
Okay, so that sort of touches on the next question that I'm going to ask. Have governments across Canada, and bear in mind, not just the federal level, we're talking about provincial level governments and municipal governments, have governments across Canada missed an opportunity to act on the climate crisis during the rollout of our economic recovery plan? If they have, do we still have an opportunity to act? There is a throne speech coming up next month, with speculation of a green recovery coming. Have governments across Canada missed the opportunity? And if so, then do we still have the opportunity to act? I'll start with Stella Markovska.
Yeah, so I mean, governments should have been acting on the climate crisis, years ago. I mean, it's been going on for, I think I read an article the other day that people have been striking for climate justice for 50 years now, or maybe even more. And so, I think like the government should have acted years ago, but now during the COVID recovery, I mean, lots of money was spent to help people who lost jobs, which I think was really good. It was very helpful, but I'm just thinking I think we still have an opportunity, because where's that kind of action towards the climate crisis? We also need the same kind of urgency towards the climate crisis. And if we keep, I think we have the opportunity now to act and make a plan, but if we keep pushing deadlines back, nothing's really going to happen. We're not really treating it like a crisis, because if we only start moving away from the fossil fuel industry in 2030, then I know, like, we're not saying we're only going to start wearing masks 3 years from now, because that's absurd. That's not going to do anything. So I think we just really need I think we have an opportunity now, because we've completely changed our way of life with COVID. I think we need to, instead of slipping back into our old habits, we need to take the opportunity now and have a plan, and we need to be acting as quickly as possible, because the faster we act, the more chances we have to prevent the climate crisis. And we need to start, just the way that we're treating the COVID crisis like it is a crisis, we need to also be treating the climate crisis with the same urgency, because the effects of it will be longer lasting and have been going on for lots of time now. So I think we really need to start acting and treating the climate crisis like a crisis.
Meredith, Adler, your thoughts? Have we missed an opportunity?
I think, I mean, I don't think that we could have definitely acted faster, but the window of opportunity is not closed. I think, I am excited to see what will come out at the end of September. I do think that the green recovery will be important, but I also think that it will be very important that it centers the people who are also have been truly impacted by COVID. And so when you're looking at that, you're looking at workers who are making somewhere close to minimum wage, women, service workers. And I think Canada needs to give a sincere thought to, are the green recovery measures things that are truly going to help those people who have been hurt? Because I think ultimately faith in these plans and faith in climate action is really necessary. You need to be building the next generation of voters and consumers to be the voters and consumers who are going to continue to push for this action and continue to give government the license to operate on this. And so I think within that, we need to see some concrete plans for just transition of fossil fuel workers, for really thinking about, okay, if Canada wants to be this innovative, clean tech, climate-driven hub, or the Centre for Nature, or whatever it is that we want Canada to be, how are we actually going to help all Canadians be part of that? Because I think currently what you see is the clean tech industry, does not have a ton of diversity, and the diversity it does have still has a very high privilege component to that. There's a really easy way to break that down and to reform education and to think differently about education, to help bring new people into the fold of those solutions. And so that's just one example, but I think overall, not too late to act, but we do really need to get going, and we do really need to think about how are we future-proofing this? How are we making this action that people will vote for forever because their lives have been made better no matter what the party is in charge down the line.
I'll come to Will Amos in a second, but Michaela Tam, your thoughts?
Well, actually, my former co-president, Janlin, who's also our external advocacy director in previous years, introduced me to this really cool database just the other day. It's called the Energy Policy Tracker, and it provides information about public funding commitments and other government policies related to energy use in G20 countries since the pandemic began. In Canada, I think at least over 12 billion is going into supporting fossil fuel energy compared to the 2.37 billion that's going into clean energy. So that's a figure that we need to kind of consider as well. We also need to think critically about, what's good and what's not. Recently, there was about 1 billion of federal funding to clean up orphaned and inactive oil and gas wells, which is really great for job creation, public health, and the environment. But there aren't conditions to prevent continued dumping by companies into inactive wells. And it actually should be the oil and gas industry's responsibility to be paying for that cleanup. That's essentially a government subsidy to oil and gas industry, like for cleanup then. And there's also a lack of transparency on the cleanup process. And of course, there have been attempts to use the pandemic as an opportunity to weaken environmental protection measures. On the federal level, Minister Wilkinson is scaling back the clean fuel standard in the short term to allow the fossil fuel industry to recover. Provincially, since I'm in Ontario, Doug Ford attempted to suspend environmental protections in April. He revoked that in June, and then the Ontario government just passed an economic recovery bill, which is Bill 197, without public consultation, which makes amendments to the Environmental Assessment Acts that allows essentially development projects to be fast forwarded and restricts Ontario residents from seeking out better environmental assessments, and also makes it easier to issue zoning orders. So this is a huge step back as well. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, that Canada's taken to work towards a green recovery. But I think on the flip side of that, there's a lot of equal opportunity to take a few back steps too.
Will Amos, do we still have an opportunity to act, especially considering that there's a speech from the throne coming? A big part of the discussion around a quote unquote Green New Deal is a green jobs program. And supposedly the speech from the throne is supposed to be one that's greener and that focuses on a green recovery. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly we've got every opportunity right now. I don't think that there's any opportunity that's been missed, and I really appreciate that this has to be a critical conversation. It has to be one that is also constructive and that recognizes that different people come from different starting points on this. The starting point that I would come from is the following. We have the most progressive government on climate issues that we've ever had in Canadian history. Does that mean we're perfect? No. Does it mean that we're a lot better than any previous government? Yes. But let's seize the opportunity at this moment to get beyond the polarizing debates that we've had over the past, in fact, more than 5 years, around pipelines on the one hand and carbon pricing on the other. It seems that so much of our energy politically and in terms of communication is getting sucked into those two polar ends. The reality from my perspective is one where our government is the first to ever at a federal level put a price on carbon pollution, which is a great first step, and we need to do more. This is a government that's invested the most in science beyond any other government in Canadian history, the most in clean tech and clean energy development, the most in public transit infrastructure, and by huge factors. These are just budgetary decisions, of course, but they're the reflection of what we want to invest in. And those are the kinds of things that bring transformative change. Earlier, I can't remember if it was Micaela or Meredith who raised the issue of clean drinking water, for example. You know, the way I look at that issue is, yes, we have work to do, but are we more than 60% of the way there in terms of getting rid of drinking water boil advisories? Absolutely. And so we need to do more and continue on the path so that we can achieve what is not just a green recovery, but get us on a path that brings a more inclusive economy, one where both not just generational impacts are taken into account, but also impacts that are geographic. I represent a riding called Pontiac, which is very rural, and the impacts and the perception of the costs associated with action and inaction on climate change are very different depending on where you live. So we need to be mindful of the different perceptions and starting points. But I think that there's absolutely no question when it comes to the, do we have an opportunity? Yes, this is a major opportunity. This is a pivot point in Canadian history. And I fundamentally believe that we as a society must demand of our own governments, and not just federal, but provincial, municipal, Indigenous. We need to change the way we have done business, particularly as regards getting us onto a more sustainable path. And I'm convinced that we have the right circumstances to get there. A minority parliament where many different voices must be listened to. We don't have a government that can just impose its will. We have a government that must listen and seek a majority of the House in order to move forward.
Okay, thank you. That concludes the first part of our discussion. We're going to be moving on to the Q&A section of this discussion, and I think we're bringing Andrew Cardozo in for this, the president of the Pearson Centre. So if anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to drop them in the box. I think I will start with this, or Andrew, go ahead. Go ahead, you can start, Andrew. Andrew, I think you're on mute.
Okay, you can hear me now.
Yep.
The first question we have is as follows. In Canada and elsewhere, we've seen better air quality during the pandemic. What can we learn from this, and will this help the public understand the reality of the climate crisis? Maybe I'll ask Meredith to start.
I'm actually not a fan of this correlation. I think yes, we have seen an increase in air quality, but I think we've seen it for the wrong reasons, and I think this really fundamentally gets to what does a cohesive climate solution look like? And a cohesive climate solution that really brings everyone along does not look like shutting down cities, and does not look like rural communities don't get to drive the vehicles that get them to and from work in the snow, all of those types of things. So I would actually say that, yes, we've had a temporary drop in emissions, but it hasn't gotten to the systemic change that we need. And I encourage people not to draw this parallel, because I would hate for you to associate a climate safe future with a pandemic. It should not feel that way. I think that we have the opportunity to build a better, more cohesive Canada in so many different ways. So that would be my main reaction.
Yeah. Stella?
Yeah, so like Meredith said, I'm also not a fan of this. I think that, a climate justice doesn't look like a pandemic. It doesn't look like shutting down cities. But I think that now that we've already completely, COVID has, put us all in quarantine and the air quality has improved, I think we shouldn't take this as, oh, everything is fine now, because it's not. As soon as we go back to the way we were before, it's just gonna get worse again. So I think that now is the time to actually, instead of slipping back into our old habits, create something better and take this as an opportunity to move forwards as opposed to moving back. And there's actually, I would like to mention Climate Strike Canada and Sustainabiliteens as part of this is organizing a Not Going Back campaign, which is going to focus on instead of going back to the way things were before, actually taking this as an opportunity to move forward and create something better.
Thank you. Michaela Tam?
Yeah, I agree with both what Meredith and Stella are saying. Also not a fan of this question when I first started seeing these posts by some of my friends on social media. Like, look at the blue skies now. I was kind of like, oh no, because in actuality, also these figures might be varied, but I think I checked from the International Energy Agency. It calculates that we'll see an 8% reduction in emissions by the end of the year, which is nothing. And compared to the societal costs and the human lives lost and human lives affected, this isn't something that we should be, advocating shutting down cities. I think the good thing about what's come out of this pandemic is that many people are now seeing that what was normal before was actually a situation of crisis. So we see a lot more conversation towards green, but not only green, but also a just recovery, and that these two components are inseparable. We've seen organizations come together and come up with just recovery principles. And a lot of these ideas, which would have seemed radical in the months before COVID, perception-wise, I think they're viewed much more as goals or a necessity now. And I think that's the direction that we should be looking at in terms of looking at the positives of this. But no, just because we see clearer skies, less pollution doesn't mean this is a good thing for the environment.
And thank you. And Will Amos.
Well, I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. I would say that there's a positive in the sense that obviously the reason there's a decline in emissions is because we're producing less, moving less, transporting less. But behind that, in our day-to-day interactions as humans, we have recognized that while we don't necessarily want to be having this kind of conversation regularly or every day, 5 Zoom meetings a day can get pretty unsustainable pretty quickly at a psychological level. I think as a society and at an individual and at a family unit level, we're recognizing that we can do more without having to move to get somewhere. And there are I think, long-term positive implications of this idea that one can work partly virtually and partly in person in the future. The normal, which was always go to the office if one had that type of occupation, that can be transformed. Now, that doesn't represent the totality of Canadians, of course. There are many Canadians who are not working under those kinds of circumstances. And to be certain as well, as I mentioned, I represent a rural riding. There are new inequities that have been or inequities that have been really underscored, and the exclamation mark has been placed on problems related to rural internet access. So the possibilities of shifting or adjusting behavior based on the experience through this COVID pandemic, those aren't necessarily equally shared across society. But the demonstration has been made that we can work differently if we need to. And so I think that the longer term, that does create opportunities to create more social efficiencies, if you will, and transportation efficiencies certainly. And I think that there are gains to be reaped going forward as a result.
Okay, I have a question for Will here. Considering that the climate crisis threatens national security to an extent, is there a role for the Department of National Defense or the military to play in combating the climate crisis?
Absolutely, absolutely, and the conversation around climate as a security issue is not a new one. I remember reading Tad Homer Dixon 20 plus years ago on this very issue. The Department of National Defense has actually been taking incredibly important measures already. I'll give you an example. Back in 2017, I made an announcement on behalf of the Minister of Defense, Harjit Sajjan, at Garrison Petawawa, and it was a $30 million announcement for energy retrofits and new energy efficiency contracts for the base. And this is happening all across the country. All sorts of investments in more efficient buildings, energy system improvements. These are, honestly, I don't think Canadians have seen 99.9% of what the Department of National Defense is doing on climate. And so maybe to take a step back away from national defense and the national security question you pose, does this moment offer to governments as a whole, not just ours, but governments as a whole, a major opportunity to reset their communications around what is being done, how it's being done, and why it's being done? Absolutely. And we need to get there because, as I said before, I think Canadians are really tired of endless polarized debates and want solutions. That's what they want, politicians working on solutions and being inclusive as they work towards those solutions. Well, a huge piece of working towards solutions is making sure that what you're communicating about what is happening is transparent and open and offers opportunities for people, to engage and point their finger to things that are actually, going forward. I mean, I don't think the vast majority of Canadians know that our government has invested way more in clean tech, in public transit infrastructure, in science. As I mentioned before, I just don't think the Canadian public is aware, and they should be, and we need to go beyond that.
Okay, I have one more question because we're running out of time. So I'm going to go Stella and then Will. There's a question from the audience. What intervention points can the government best use to support youth-led climate solutions? Stella?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the government can start listening to youth movements and kind of start focusing on making a specific plan on a just transition from the fossil fuel economy and a recovery from COVID also at the same time, and sort of making a green transition that leaves nobody behind. And I think there needs to be a specific plan on how we're going to do this and immediate action taken. And as to youth movements, I think this is really what we're advocating for. We're advocating for a Green New Deal to be implemented, so a specific plan on how we can make a green and just recovery that leaves nobody behind.
Will?
It's a great question. I don't want to just state the obvious, but the Prime Minister recently indicated that the process for youth applications to join the Prime Minister's Youth Council, they've been extended to the end of August. This is a major opportunity for youth who participate in the climate justice movement. Absolutely, there's no reason not to make sure that that voices are heard loud and clear. But near term, looking at specifically what is going to be happening in Parliament at the legislative level, our government committed in the last election to bring forth climate legislation that goes beyond what we legislated in the first mandate. In the first mandate, a price on carbon pollution was legislated, and if the provinces didn't act, they were going to have there was a federal backstop that would be imposed. But now we have a commitment to bring forth binding 5-year plans, and based on every conversation I've had with Environment Minister Wilkinson, he has every intention of fulfilling his mandate letter, which is to bring forward legislation related to climate. And in that context, the question you've asked is around youth participation. The youth of Canada should be involved in that legislative process. They should be reviewing the legislation and commenting through their member of parliament and making representations to the standing committee that reviews it. I mean, at a certain point, there are formal proceedings, and that's what I've just mentioned here, the legislative process. But of course, there will be opportunities as well. I think that it would be absolutely appropriate in knowing that our government is going to be advancing a speech from the throne, which is a statement of intent of the direction of our government to bring Canada and to secure Parliament's confidence. It makes absolute sense for the youth of Canada to convey to our government through members of Parliament and through the Prime Minister and through various ministers, what would one want to see specifically in a speech from the throne. I think that that'd be absolutely appropriate, and I would welcome that kind of input.
Okay, last question here before we wrap up. It says, what are the panelists' view of how COVID has shifted the public imagination of what is possible vis-a-vis, for example, responsive legislation and fiscal policy, and how can that impact climate action? Michaela Tam?
I think this is already a lot about what we already talked about in terms of, for like a lot of the things that seemed more radical a few months ago are now seen as more, necessities or things that aren't viewed as such far-fetched kind of things. I'd like to actually sort of also make note of the fact that when we're talking about youth being part of the legislative process and whatnot, we're also talking about the fact that there are certain types of youth that are overrepresented as well. So we're looking at not only youth as a uniform population, but Indigenous youth, but Black youth, and a lot of these sort of youth, and like who's being overrepresented in media. And a lot of consciousness, I think, in the last few months has been on this and how to also, I say this a lot, is that we need to acknowledge our privilege. The fact that I'm at this panel today is very indicative of the privilege that I have and the access to these platforms. If we're not talking about these things, then we're not also going to go forward as well. And, giving people these voices. So my answer is that, yeah, I don't really have much to say other than what's already been said, because of the fact that we just need to be thinking a lot more intersectionally. And we have been thinking a lot more intersectionally. And I think that is what defines what's possible as well. And it really recenters what we need to focus on.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'll pass it over to Andrew Cardozo for sort of concluding statements.
Well, thanks very much, Ashman, for your moderation, and a sincere thank you to Michaela Tam, Stella Markovska, Will Amos, and Meredith Adler, who's had to leave already. We really appreciate this discussion, and I think it turns out to be very timely. We're having this discussion the day after the government has announced that there's going to be a throne speech. To the last point that Will Amos has made, I think there's a real opportunity now and in the days ahead, and I would say in the next sort of 2 to 3 weeks, not more, for people to get their views across to MPs, to the Prime Minister, to people like Will, because Will is certainly, as I watch what happens on the Hill, one of the MPs who understands and has addressed these issues and fought for the environmental issues all his adult life. I think he certainly looked at very credibly in the caucus and on the Hill as one of the MPs that really understands these issues. So I'd say you use these people as best you can to put forward these issues, because the time is awfully important. We've come out of a very a crisis period in Canada and the world over. This is a good time to be reimagining Canada. The series that we've had is about reimagining Canada, and certainly this is one of the important issues. I just want to tell our audience we've got a few more sessions planned in the weeks ahead. We have a session on innovation in industry with Innovation Minister Navdeep Bains on October the 24th, and we have other webinars coming up on the future work, cybersecurity in a remote situation, especially remote workplaces, early childhood education, and the effects on investment. So please join us for these webinars. Keep in touch with our website. Thank you for being here. And I know that there are a lot of other people who want to applaud all of you. You can't hear them. So since we can't hear them, I'm going to ask you to clap for each other. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Micaela. Thank you, Stella. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you.